So Matthew, why don't you take it away?
Can we hold on 1 second? I just gotta do something real quick.
He's trying to get voluntary departure for a couple of clients today. So that's Matthew's big contribution.
Yeah, that's what I do. I call it Michael Avenatti, and
oh God,
it works out well.
He crowdfunds.
And then the great part is I get to fly to like Guatemala, take videos with them.
Remember when Michael Avenatti went to Guatemala to look for kids?
Oh God,
what a weird world.
I'm just proud to say I was never fooled by that maniac. He blocked me like right away.
Anyways, let's get started, Matthew.
Okay. So today we have Silky Shah with us. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
That's the first.
I mean, it looks easy enough, but
it's a English word, so the British colonization helped with that.
There you go. And she's the executive director at the Detention Watch Network. And she's active on Twitter. And this is how we all form our relationships nowadays, by knowing people from Twitter.
Matthew and I are old enough to have met on Facebook.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine?
I never go on there anymore, so yeah.
My account got deleted somehow when I was on vacation like a month ago, and I haven't looked back. So anyways, Silky's on with us to talk about advocating to close detention centers. And shockingly, I've found out that there are immigration attorneys who are against closing detention centers. And there have been some questions raised by our colleagues. So we kind of want to talk about that and, acknowledge that when detention centers close, right, that doesn't solve everything, even for that one little community. And sometimes it does create issues that need to be discussed. But certainly I'm very happy and pleased that there are organizations like Detention Watch Network and so many of these other organizations that are fighting to close these detention centers, because regular listeners would know I think we should end all immigration detention. I don't think there's any need for the only reason why an immigrant is detained is purely because they are an immigrant. The most heinous crimes that an immigrant may commit, and you hear it all the time, I'm sure Silky, you hear it, like, what about the child molester? What about the rapist? Whatever, thing that they want to go on. They're so dangerous, don't we have to detain them? But we know once their criminal sentence is done, if they were a U.S. citizen, they would be released. An immigrant would be detained. So the only reason they're being detained is because they are an immigrant. So we want to talk about that. I want to hear more about the work that you guys do and what you think about the tension between closing down detention centers and some of the arguments that we hear against it. So thank you. And tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you guys do over there.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So yeah, Detention Watch Network is a national coalition. We were formed in 1997 after the passage of the 1996 laws because more and more people were getting detained. We kind of became a more official network in around 2005. And since then, detention has obviously grown a lot, but it's been a pretty amazing trajectory where we have a lot of groups that are legal service providers, people who are directly impacted by detention, people who are organizers in their community saying, we don't want this to happen here, faith organizations, lots of folks, policy organizations in DC saying, actually, for a long time, we want to do something about the detention system, expose the harms. And then in 2012, we took a position of detention abolition. So to your point, Matthew, we don't believe anybody should be detained for their immigration status. And so a lot of the work we do is now really trying to reduce the system. So doing both organizing on the ground, working with groups that are doing site fights against particular detention centers. And then at the federal level, advocating for shifts in policy. And with Biden actually pushing him to start closing facilities, but also reducing funding for DHS, ICE, and CBP in particular. And then a lot of narrative work. We've done some research on how to sort of message about detention and the sort of perspective people have on detention and trying to shift the conversation and say, actually, people can go through their immigration proceedings not behind bars.
Now, I once had a client disappeared from the Northwest Detention Center. They were at the Northwest Detention Center, and then the next day they were gone. And the family was freaking out. We have a list of all the officers there. And of course, the officer who you're supposed to talk to never answers. And so you just have to start calling everyone. And eventually I got a hold of ICE, and they basically said that they weren't sure where he was. And he popped up, I want to say 3 or 4 days later in Louisiana, just because. I don't know if it was a bed space issue or, they of course didn't really explain the why, but there was no reason for him to be there. And so the one argument that we hear sometimes from advocates is, look, we have the Northwest Detention Center. It's a private geo detention center. It's in Tacoma. It covers a geographical area. If your person's detained, you know where they're going to go. And if you get rid of it, it's not like detention stops. People will be sent off to, we've had clients sent randomly to county jails in Oregon or in Louisiana, like I mentioned, and that is actually an added stress for legal representatives, for families, and for the detainees. So what do you say to that particular argument that you hear sometimes?
I think that's a really important question, and like one that we're sort of grappling with, especially in these conversations that are happening in the Northeast right now. They've happened here in Washington State, in California. I think there's a lot of things there. So one is, if a detention center is closing down, one of the things we're really pushing for right now is releases, not transfers. So the people who are currently there, ensuring their release to community, or say they are from somewhere else but detained there, figuring out a way to get them released and like get them back home or get the resources that they need. And so that's a big push. It's not going to be perfect. I mean, one of the things I say to people is that the system is really harmful. The detention system is doing so much harm, and tearing down, like moving towards abolition, is not going to be a perfect process. And that's just the reality of it. So there might be some transfers, but one of the things we're doing some research on and sort of understanding the incentives in place, you have the Northwest Detention Center, which has grown and grown and grown since it was built in, I think, 2005-ish, and went from like 500 beds to now 1,500 beds. And because there's this guaranteed minimum at the facility that says you're going to get paid, Geo Group is going to get paid for at least 1,100 people there right now, then there's this incentive for ICE to say, oh, we actually want to detain people there. And then during the Obama administration, for all those years and early part of Trump, there was actually a quota built into the appropriations language that said we shall maintain no less than 34,000-ish beds. And so detention itself being in a place creates a lot of that incentive. And, we have some anecdotal evidence and doing some work on some more quantitative evidence on like apprehensions actually going down whenever a detention center is shut down. This in Contra Costa County in California. We've heard some of that. And so I think that's something to consider. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is like sort of what you were saying, Stephen, is like, we have no control over ICE. They're going to do whatever they want. So some idea that we keep a detention center in one community isn't going to prevent transfers or prevent other things. You never know what's going to happen. And ICE for a long time, I mean, during the Bush administration, I think the majority of people were transferred at least 2 or 4 times. Maybe that went down a little bit under Obama, but transfers happen all the time for no reason. Maybe they're adjusting things, who knows? But so we don't really have that control. I think the other thing, and one of the things that comes up a lot from attorneys, is just this assumption like this is the way it's going to be. So it's like this sort of mitigate harm strategy versus like harm reduction strategy versus an abolition strategy. And ultimately, it's such a cynical approach because actually right now we have more opportunity. And I know that sounds absurd given the moves by Biden, but we have more opportunity than we've ever had to reduce this system. So if this is going to help build up that power that we have on the ground to get Biden to take additional action, then I think we have to take our chances here.
I think you're right. And the way I look at it is when you close down a detention facility, obviously those individuals, we want them released, right? We understand there are going to be transfers. For example, in York, PA, the York Detention Center is closing down. I think its last days are coming up relatively soon. So they had to move all those people. Now, there were a group of lawyers who were upset about the detention facility closing down and whined about it. And then they were trying to fight to keep the court open for whatever reason. I still don't understand. But then there are other attorneys like Bridget Cambria, friend of the show, and Aldea, who decided, okay, we're going to just roll up our sleeves and try to get as many people released as possible. And they've been doing a great job with it. But the complaint that I hear from attorneys that belong to the Philadelphia ALA chapter, which I'm a member of, is like, well, hey, my clients are being transferred and I'm the attorney they chose. And now my client is in Alabama or Louisiana or down in Florida, and they don't have access to counsel. Like, well, first of all, there are lawyers out there. There are networks that you can reach out and you can represent them yourselves. You can talk to them by phone. You can go down there if it's that important. But a lot of these lawyers, I really think they need to kind of get over themselves. There are other lawyers around the country that do detention work. I've represented people in PA and New Jersey, from Washington State, from California, far afield from their families. And it sucks. It does suck that they are moved around like this. Here in York, that detention facility being closed, hopefully that will spur movement to help other detention centers close. Maybe it gets our senators from PA not so invested, and our congressmen from that area not so invested in immigration detention because it's not a monetary benefit anymore to us. So maybe they're more willing to cut things out of the ICE budget to move to at least lowering detention for immigration. So I don't really see these as valid arguments. But there is a criticism of people like you, Silky. Only you are myopic. All you want to do is close detention centers. You don't care about anything else that happens. Why aren't you fighting for universal representation? Obviously, you're Detention Watch Network, so that's all you care about. So tell us.
Why are you so narrow-minded?
Answer that criticism that we have seen on Twitter.
Right.
I mean, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what to say about that, because so much of what we're doing is actually it's actually so much harder to fight your case if you're in detention than if you're out of detention. That's the reality. And detention essentially facilitates deportation. The purpose of detention is to make the deportation easier. So from that framework, I disagree.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
And also, right, you can have advocates for specific things. We don't need to be advocates for everything, right? We can have silos. We can have those people on the ground that just want to end that detention center. And that's great. And other people can advocate for other things. We can all work together, hold hands. We can get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a point. Ultimately, we need to work together. And I think that's why I love Detention Watch Network and our network, is that there's a lot of people who are trying to figure this out together. And we've seen so much movement. So for instance, here in Washington State, when we started having conversations with the Shutdown Coalition, that conversation was happening with Northwest Immigrant Rights Project from the very beginning. And they were supportive in sort of thinking about how do we do this? I mean, and especially when you look at Northwest Detention Center, it's in Tacoma, it's in a city, it's not that far for people to get to. If you've been to a lot of detention centers around the country, it's certainly not the worst. I would say York is definitely on the list of one of the worst places in the country. And I'm so glad that detention is ending there, although it will stay open as a prison or a jail. But I think that it's so necessary that we work together. And I think Hudson County is a really good example of this fight. So in 2018, when the county freeholders announced that they were going to phase out the contract at Hudson, the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project came together and released a statement saying, we're totally down with abolish ICE, but ultimately the laws are the laws, and this is the reality that we're in, and we're going to advocate for keeping this detention center open. And, it was a big deal because I think this is where the tension between universal representation and detention closure came into play, because you had all of a sudden, there was so much work that went into getting representation for New York residents who are held at Hudson in New Jersey, and the really incredible work happening to support them. But those attorneys at the time weren't actually talking to the organizers and thinking about the best way to approach this, and instead just sort of went ahead and made their statement. And I think similar things in York are happening and have happened in other instances. But what's interesting about the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project is that over time, as those relationships have developed, as they've sort of had those conversations, they've now actually come full circle. I think last year they stayed neutral on the decision to end the Hudson contract. And now they're actually really supporting closure of facilities through the New York Dignity for Detention Act. And so I think a lot of that work is about those relationships. How do you have those conversations? How do you do this in the way that's going to protect as many people as possible? And I think one of the things that for Detention Watch Network, we work with people all across the country. So I think there is this framework of, well, people are just going to go to the South. And it's like, well, we're supporting organizers in Alabama, in Texas, in Georgia, in Florida, like, to close facilities. And yes, the resources aren't there in the same way, but just because they aren't there doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do something there to also support that work. So I do think there are examples. I think in California, there's been so much work that's happened with the Dignity Not Detention Coalition there to figure this out and how attorneys, organizers, people directly impacted can all work together. And one of the things about universal representation, it's hard because it's usually not universal, like everybody isn't getting representation, but also 40, 50% maybe in best case scenario get relief in some way. So there's still a lot of folks who are deported. And ultimately we need to change the infrastructure, change these laws so more people have relief or have the ability to not be detained or stay in this country. So I think it only goes so far. Again, it's a harm reduction strategy. It's an important one. But thinking about if it's a universal rep program that has money that can go somewhere else, or like, can you support an attorney in, Washington State to help somebody out versus like just that's it, that's over. So like thinking about and making sure that universal representation efforts don't tie to detention specifically, because that was sort of the problem in the New York example where they're like, okay, Hudson County's there, we're going to support people here. But there's a lot of need for representation across the board.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I think is a really important point, which is that detention becomes a breeding ground for bad decisions from judges. And also, I think some of the most predatory lawyer practices that I've seen personally on the decision side. So the same judge that decides on a case will decide on bond. And it creates this perverse incentive structure where I've had judges deny cases and then deny bond saying, well, you're unlikely to succeed on appeal because the underlying decision is so sound, their own decision. And they know that if they can keep the person detained, that person will almost certainly reach a breaking point. I've had very few detained clients who've been willing to take a case all the way through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals process. And the one client I've had do that, who was detained for, I think, 3 years, got kicked back down to the original judge who had denied bond, saying that he was unlikely to succeed at the Ninth Circuit, which he did. And then the judge summarily dismissed the case again on an equally terrible decision, sending him back into a 3-year appeal process. And I've really, really seen how these judges can get away with obviously, I respect and love all the judges, right? I do personally, but I've seen examples in other people's cases with other unnamed judges where the judges can get away with very sloppy reasoning, very shoddy decisions, just sort of knowing that like the chances of this person sitting through an appeal are very, very low. And then those decisions don't get corrected and they go on in perpetuity. And then on the lawyer side, I mean, look, there's plenty of bad lawyers, but some of the stuff I've seen from the detained docket where lawyers know, like, we're going to be in and out of this case in a month. I can show up. I don't really have to file that much. I can fill this client and their family full of promises, and then it'll just be boom, boom, done. I've seen some really, really shoddy work. And those are the same lawyers who are concerned about, oh, if this detention center closes, I'm going to lose my source of revenue. All of the good lawyers I know who are doing good ethical work on the detained docket, they're fine with the Northwest Detention Center closing because they know that there's plenty of other work to be done. But it's the predatory ones, in my opinion, who raise the biggest stink about closing a detention center.
Yeah, I mean, like having a detained docket, having a situation where detention exists is just a disadvantage for everybody. And so I think it's this idea, again, Detention Watch Network doesn't believe in the incarceration of immigrants. It's a part of the bigger system of the prison industrial complex in the US. But also, again, it is the thing that helps facilitate deportation. And one of the things to keep in mind, and sort of going back to this sort of transfers question, is like ICE is the agency that arrests and detains and deports. Like ICE has control over the whole entire mechanism, and the prosecutors and the judges are in the mix there. But I think it's so important to understand that having the detention center around creates those incentives. Like, I mean, both of you know this. There's so many instances where somebody who is mandatorily detained is released because of like maybe what's happening with the capacity. So they'll say, oh, we can't release this person. But it's like they release people who are mandatorily detained all the time. That's not like a thing that they can't do. They actually have full discretion here, and they're making the choices based on the space.
The opposite is true
Well,
too.
I mean, Stephen, I want to reference back to the York situation. And to be clear, the York prison didn't renew their contracts, so they were shutting down. And then there were a group of lawyers from the Philadelphia AILA chapter who had put out this letter to attempt to keep the court open, not to keep the detention center open. Now, from a cynical point of view, if you keep a court open in a detention facility, you're inviting them to start redetaining immigrants. But these lawyers who wrote this letter are really good lawyers. I mean, they're really good, and I know them. And that's why it kind of hurt me personally so much to see this letter come out. In this letter, one part they referenced international human rights, labor rights, as far as the staff at the York court, because they were going to be without jobs and they might have to go to far off courts like Baltimore, which is less than an hour away, or Philadelphia, or federal employees who are going to be just fine. But they referenced it, and that was it was silly, but also disgusting. But they're all, the people I know that were in on it were good lawyers. But you're right, there are shoddy ones who are very happy to keep detention centers open. But it leads me to New Jersey, my home state. And Silky, you referenced the fight at Hudson County. I think that was the impetus for a bill that passed the Senate and the legislature for New Jersey to not permit ICE contracts for detention at either private or public facilities that Governor Murphy promised he was going to sign, and he's kind of not signing it yet. So everyone's getting a little nervous. And the New Jersey State Bar Association wrote a letter against the bill, encouraging him to veto the bill. And there were public hearings on it. And there was a member of FAIR speaking against the bill. And then there was the president of the New Jersey State Bar Association, the immigration law section, also speaking against the bill. So when you have an immigration lawyer siding with FAIR on detention issues, you really have to question yourself. His name's Alan Pollack. He's an immigration lawyer in New Jersey. He's been a member of AILA. I think he was New Jersey AILA president. But he came out, and his point is much that we touched upon about representation, clients not being able to have the representation they want, being sent off to far field places like Alabama, where they wouldn't be able to see family, which is crazy because I've only had a handful of clients in detention ever get to see their family while they're in detention, even detention centers that are very close to them. But that is what we're dealing with, and I'm a little shocked. Silky, do you think these people are an anomaly in the immigration law community, or do you think I'm just kind of naive and being so surprised?
Well, I don't know if I think either of those things, but I think ultimately this has been the conversation. This has been the conversation for many, many years. And it was interesting whenever the York letter came out from the attorneys. And I feel like you were posting about this, Matthew, about Philly AILA not signing on to it. And I remember a friend and I were like, actually, that's a movement. That's actually kind of amazing that Philly AILA was like, no, we're not going to support this effort. And the fact that New York Immigrant Family Unity Project...
Actually, sorry to interrupt, when I posted about it, AILA National got into my DM saying, like, this is not AILA. AILA National is not for this. I had to make that correction. The fact that we had to vote on it as a chapter kind of pissed me off. And I don't know what the vote was, but I was very happy because I would have dropped out of ALEF Philly in a second.
It's tough, like you said. I mean, I think part of the challenge of, a report that we wrote recently was sort of talking about a just transition from detention economies, because ultimately a lot of this comes into play where you have these local communities in New Jersey, for sure, where they're like, bail reform happened. They had a bunch of empty beds. They grew the detention system to some degree there. They started losing revenue, and like these sort of questions about if you take detention out, so many of these counties are dependent on these federal dollars, and certain places get $1 per day for somebody who's detained, or, there's all these different sort of economic factors at play, and the attorneys are one of them as well. And so I think this is the thing, like, what is the just transition away from these economies? And I mean, the New Jersey piece was really hard to swallow, especially because the framework of the Bar Association push is let's reform the conditions, which is just wild. I mean, I think again, Northwest Detention Center, everyone's like, oh, this is one of the nicer facilities. And there's so many horrible things that happen in that place. I mean, it's really incredible whenever you put people in this system that people are meant to spend a few days. But like you were saying, Stephen, you have people who spend sometimes years in these facilities and, might not have any outdoor recreation, might not have any ability to see anybody in person ever, so I will say, in terms of this question of where the movement is at, it's shifted. And I think groups like American Immigration Council coming out and saying, we're ready to end detention. Some of these legal service providers on the ground really ready and committed to doing that shows the shift that's happening. But also, this is still just going to be a huge challenge. And it played a huge role in the Hudson decision back in, I think, November, December of last year. They brought up that press release from New York Immigrant Family Unity Project multiple times in this sort of framework of, well, we're helping these people by detaining them there, which is just wild. And so I think I will say I'm more hopeful largely because movement has happened. And I also think it's because of externally what's happening. I mean, the truth is, DWN, when we became an abolitionist organization in 2012, I think a lot of people were like, that's totally far-fetched. That's not going to work. And then last summer, after the uprisings and after this sort of bigger conversation about the role of incarceration and policing in our society, a lot of groups were like, oh, yeah, actually, this doesn't totally make sense. We're maybe a couple steps forward and now a step back, especially with what's happening with the Biden administration right now and the border and the deterrence political framework we're negotiating. But I do think that it's harder for these attorneys to make those arguments. And I think they're seeing that.
One for the New Jersey State Bar Association, in their letter, I'm going to paraphrase, they said, we're against immigration detention unless there's a basis in law for it, or something like that. And what the listeners should understand is there's really almost always a basis in law for the immigrants that are in detention. Now, there are some immigrants who would be detained, who are unlawfully detained, and that happens. But on the whole, on a percentage, that's pretty rare. If you walk into an immigration court, we don't have them anymore. You'd have masters filled with 60 immigrants waiting to see the judge. If I swooped in and put them all into detention, they would probably have a basis in law for doing so. So I think people have to really understand what a tenuous situation a lot of these immigrants are in, even those who are not currently in detention. So for New Jersey State Bar Association to say oh, we're against immigration detention unless there's a basis in law, what you're saying is you're for immigration detention. I just want to point that out.
I was just going to point out that you're also naive. The answer to the question was
no, that's true.
Yes to both. That's what I was trying. I had a really well-timed joke, and then you had to put some sort of long diatribe in front of it and just ruin the timing.
I'm sorry. We can, do you want to just say it now and we can have it edited in?
No, that's okay. So one of the main things here is that one of the positive things that you guys are doing is just making this an issue, because I think many people don't understand. When I talk about a client doing 3 years in the Northwest Detention Center, he wasn't sentenced to that time. It wasn't a sentence he was serving out. I actually had a client once who had done real prison time tell me that immigration detention was so much worse because there was this unknown timeline on it. When you're doing time in federal prison, for whatever reason, okay, this is the date. I'm working towards something. Those days are falling away. When you're in immigration detention, An honest immigration lawyer will tell you, well, the appeals process could take 3 years. And then if we win, we might lose again after another 6 months. And you just don't know. You could fight all those years and then lose and be in the same position if you just left at the beginning. And so it's very, very hard psychologically. And like Matthew was saying, these are people that they haven't been deemed a danger by the criminal court. They've served their sentence, if there was a sentence at all. And so just putting it out there that this is happening, that it's a grave injustice. I see a lot of the sort of, can we say, is that a bad thing now? Is that that refers to the, right? We can take all this out. What do you like? All this sort of like trying to do it halfway.
Half-ass?
Half-assed, yeah. These sort of half measures.
Half measures. There we go. Let's go with that.
It's not a perfect analogy, but it's somewhat similar to saying like, well, what if we did some slaves? And what if like we made it a little bit better for them? And let's just focus on conditions and maybe reducing overall numbers. But the institution is just sort of a given. We would look at that now as morally reprehensible and not nearly enough, right? And immigration detention, you could rank them, I guess, in terms of their terribleness, but in the same way is totally unjustified, right? And so just getting more people to pay attention to this issue and to advocate for it in their communities is a good thing. So how can people find you and contribute and get involved?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's interesting. Folks who engage with Detention Watch Network or work on detention, they just kind of become obsessive because it's just like, this is wild. Why is this even happening? And it would be great for folks who are interested to get involved or engage. I mean, I think right now, actually, one of the big conversations we're having as a network and with communities on the ground is just closures. So trying to figure out how closures can happen in a way that protects as many people as possible, gets them released, and makes it happen in a way that isn't doing additional harm. So detentionwatchnetwork.org is our website. We are on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and have a lot of resources there. I mean, I think a lot of the different things I mentioned earlier, we do site fights. So if you're working in a community that has a detention center, we can connect you with folks that we're working with. If you're interested in addressing federal advocacy, we do a lot of work around defunding the system. So we have this Defund Hate campaign. And yeah, I mean, I think those are some good ways to get involved. And, things are a challenge right now. But again, I think we're 6 months in. It's not been great on this front, but I do think, we still have some opportunity. So we got to try.
Right on.
Do you think, or do you have any belief or hope that this administration in the next coming years will be more open to limited detention? Or do you think, they are who they look like they are?
So far, the moves have been not great. I mean, it is really significant that they made the announcement to phase out the contract at Irwin and Bristol, which are both horrible places. And we had never seen that before. So I think that's quite significant. And one of our big campaigns is to close 10 facilities in the first year, and Irwin was one of them. So that was a victory. But everything else, like, I don't know if y'all saw, there's a pregnancy directive. So there's these memos, this sort of Obama era liberal memo mentality, and similar to like the PD memo or other things where it's like, they still have all the discretion, but here are recommendations of how you do this. And that's concerning because if they still have the same amount of infrastructure in place, the same number of ICE agents, the same number of detention beds, it's hard to imagine things shifting significantly. So
the pregnancy memo was, if a detainee is pregnant, we're probably going to release them.
Yeah.
Not like what? I mean, that's kind of always been the case. Like, I don't think it's like this huge move or anything, but for me, that looked more like a public relation thing than anything else. And
I mean, ICE is still the ICE that it was a year ago. I mean, like, folks have started to change, but those agents on the ground were emboldened by Trump. So that's what we're negotiating. We're negotiating this workforce that actually, if it stays in this level, I don't know how much will change. So I don't know. I kind of can't do this job if I don't remain hopeful. So I'm doing everything I can. And like with our network. And the fact that Washington, Oregon, California, Illinois, New Jersey, maybe New York, also Maryland, like all these places have passed like state legislation to phase out detention is hugely significant. So I think that's going to come to a head for them.
I think the extreme frustration with the executive should always be there. If you don't feel that, then you're cheerleading like it's a sports thing or something like that. So you should feel that. Maybe the takeaway is that people should continue to push in that direction, obviously, but pursue more localized goals where like real victories can be achieved, whether it's at the county level. If you find out that your county jail is used as a holding facility for ICE, local politics can be really simple, actually, with a couple of meetings, a couple of letters, and the next thing you know, you've got the ball rolling. And those victories can kind of sustain you while that big ball of frustration sort of stays there.
No, and that's how we've seen the change. I mean, that's where a lot of the enforcement work has happened, work against secure communities or 287G or detainers under Obama shifted towards this, let's stop detaining generally. And it's exciting to see. There's so much organizing and excitement about this. And I think supporting and resourcing that is better than a lot of the folks who are like, they're just going to go to Alabama, Louisiana. There's just this like sort of dismissiveness to that, which is unhelpful.
And I think when the top sees that things down below are succeeding and nothing drastic is happening, that I think it gives more cover for them, makes it more comfortable. So that's why people are complaining, they're going to move them to Alabama, just like it's a fait accompli that detention is always going to be there. But we have to show that, okay, hopefully New Jersey can eliminate detention, immigration detention, and then see that, okay, everything is still fine. It worked. And then those resources that we have in New Jersey, we can hopefully transfer them somewhere else. So hopefully movements and people like you and your organization and all those amazing organizers that I think lawyers do not give enough credit to will keep really pushing, because me and Stephen are really tired. We're just overwhelmed. But the organizers, people like you that can really keep pushing and pushing the envelope. Because look, 2 years before Trump became president, if you talked about building a wall across the entire southern border, you would have been laughed at. And now that's kind of taken for granted. There's a whole segment of the population that can't believe it hasn't been done. So they push envelopes, and I'm always glad that when our side is pushing envelopes, because hopefully one day we'll look and like there's no immigration detention or immigration detention at such a low level that it can be handled somewhat. But thank you so much for what you're doing. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I hope we get there at some point. I think there's some more room in this administration. We'll see, but I don't know. Like they're getting fought on the other side, like you said so much. I think there was also this moment with COVID where it felt like it was a little bit of an aberration because you're like, oh, the numbers are so low. Can we actually keep them down here? And that's taken a turn for the worse. But yeah, definitely a lot of opportunity still. So let's try.
All right. Well, we'll be in touch. Thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.